Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello. On this episode, I'm exploring human risk in the world of sport, and in a particular part of sport that has recently provided a considerable number of human risk-related stories, some of which I've covered in my newsletter. That's football, or soccer for my US listeners. Even if you're not a football fan, stick with this, because not only is my guest incredibly knowledgeable and personable, but he's got some fascinating insights that I know you'll find interesting. And if you really don't understand how anyone can enjoy watching 22 people kicking a ball around a field, then definitely stick around, because I think you'll get a picture of why others do, and you'll get a really interesting perspective on human risk. Who knows, you might even be tempted into joining the ranks of those of us that do. Raphael Honigstein is a highly respected football journalist and expert commentator. He writes for The Athletic, a sports journal to which I subscribe. He also works for a number of other media outlets. UK listeners may recognise him from his appearances on the BT Sport TV channel. He's also the host of a football podcast called Stylecast, which, as the name suggests, focuses on his primary area of specialism, the German Bundesliga. Rapha grew up in Germany and now lives in London, which gives him a unique insight into not just German football, but also other leagues, including the English Premier League. I invited Rapha on because I thoroughly enjoy reading his journalism, and because a large number of his articles focus on the psychological and human aspects of the sport, whether that's the people management skills of individual coaches or the mental pressures on players and teams when they're doing far better or far worse than expected. More recently, he's covered the impact of coronavirus on football, both off the pitch in terms of the financial implications for teams that are heavily dependent on gate receipts and TV money, but also on pitch, exploring whether home advantage means anything when you're playing to an empty stadium. Unless, like me, you're a regular watcher of the Bundesliga, then some of the names and teams we talk about might not mean anything. Though some, like the team I support, Bayern Munich, probably will. Yes, I know I've probably alienated some listeners and won a few more by mentioning that, but that's all part of the fun. The Bundesliga also produced a name you might just recognise. Jurgen Klopp, the coach of Premier League winning team Liverpool, who began his career in the Bundesliga and is the subject of one of Rapha's books. Links to those are in the show notes. In our discussion, I firstly asked Rapha about his passion for the game and how he became a sports journalist. Then we explore a range of different aspects of the game that have a human risk angle. How some teams have bent the rules to allow external investors, something that German football has fought hard to prevent for reasons we discuss, and why some managers can extract far better performances from their team than others. We also talk about what the introduction of video assistant referees, a video replay system designed to eliminate human error on the part of referees, has meant, and why it seems to have worked much better in Germany than in England. And we explore why football players command such high transfer fees and the varied implications of coronavirus on the game. There's a ton of psychology, human error, and human excellence here. Finally, I ask Rapha about his thoughts on the upcoming European Champions League competition that's been delayed and will soon be restarted in a very different format to normal. And yes, my team is still very much in the running. If you're not already a football fan, then do feel free to join me in supporting them. So whether you're a die-hard fan or have very little knowledge of the sport, I think you'll find something in here to make you think. I've included links to articles that explain the details behind the stories we cover, so if something piques your interest, check out the show notes. For now, on with the show and my discussion with Raphael Honigstein. So Rapha, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Look, it's my absolute pleasure. And I guess before we talk about the sport that you clearly have a passion for, I wanted to find out how you got, what interested you in football and what made you become a sports journalist.
I mean, I guess I was born with the interest in football. As long as I can remember, I was kicking a ball around, watching games on television in the stadium in Munich. And it was always one of the most important things to me. The journalism thing happened by accident. I was studying law in London and I had friends in the media in Munich. And one day one of them asked me, you meet nice, interesting people in London. Why don't you write about these? And I started with writing about music and fashion and, art and just lifestyle issues, really. And then from there, I stumbled into football because my good friend and colleague who was doing the job that I'm doing now, Ronnie Rang, moved on to Barcelona in 2001. And he was basically asking the people that took his copy, do you need someone else? And they all said yes. And he said, well, there's this guy who doesn't really write about football at the moment, but he likes football. I'm sure he can do the job. And that was me.
That's amazing.
Oh, it just goes to show it's not what you know, it's just who you know.
But, what clearly comes out is you are writing about something you are passionate about. And it's very rare to find people that can combine job that covers a topic they love, and that just comes through in the way that you write. So presumably it was relatively easy to slip into that space.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, it doesn't feel like a job always, and I think that is the best part of it. It didn't when I wrote about music and I went to see concerts and stuff, and it still unfortunately still doesn't quite feel like a real job either now with football down 15, 20 years down the line. So I guess I'm lucky in that sense. I'm doing something that doesn't feel like like a huge drag or anything. It's fun, and therefore I think putting the hours in and stuff isn't perhaps quite as arduous as if I was doing something that was just there to provide a paycheck. So I guess like most people in our industry, I'm very grateful and very lucky that I'm able to earn a living doing something that is fun.
And look, in recent months, it's been really interesting, right? Because the thing that you normally write about, along with large other swathes of society, came to a kind of grinding halt, and there was no sport. How was that as a journalist?
It was very strange. To a certain extent, we at The Athletic were slightly less affected because our stuff is more reliant on features, on sometimes historic stuff, on interviews. So the games themselves, we didn't miss them that much, at least not to begin with. But I think what we all sensed, and was borne out in the numbers, I think, when it came to the engagement from readers, etc., is that people's priorities shifted. I think, in the first few weeks, everyone was worried about the situation. Everyone was worried about toilet paper and putting food on the table and all these kind of things. And the last thing I think you wanted to do that in those early weeks was to get up and read about your favorite football team. It was somewhere in the background, but with no games being on, I think everyone sort of just kind of paused and things came to a halt. And I think it was a bit of a struggle, to kind of trying to stay relevant in a bit of a vacuum. But as soon as the Bundesliga came back, and then very quickly the Premier League decided, okay, they can follow the example, I think momentum started to build. And while we're still far away from normal life as far as going to game is concerned, etc., it is still I think enough for people to feel that passion and that interest again. So I think as someone working in that space, it's very difficult when you're doing something and you wonder how relevant it is because people, have other interests, much more important interests at this moment in time. And I think, the fact that football is back shows, at least momentarily, that we've moved on to less important things, but the sort of things that you enjoy and go beyond the absolute, bare necessities of food and shelter.
Yeah, and it was fascinating. I realised after a while quite how much of my weekends was taken up by watching sport. When it suddenly disappears, you're like, well, what am I supposed to do of a Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, I mean, it's very liberating to begin with, but after a while, you're thinking every day is kind of the same, and I think we kind of need that routine that comes from having something to look forward to that is just a little bit different, and it kind of takes you out of your space, even if it's just 90 minutes. And I think, yes, of course, watching Netflix can have a similar effect, but nothing quite does it like football in terms of how it kind of just controls and influences all your emotions and also demands sort of absolute kind of concentration and focus. I'm sure some people watch it, in a pub and they don't really care. It's just in the background. But certainly for me, I'm kind of very zoned in when I watch a game, and I did realize that I miss it quite a lot.
Right. And of course, one of the dynamics that we've seen has been the what they in Germany call Geisterspiele, so the games without crowds there. And there's been a lot of noise around, ruining the sanctity of the sport. But equally, that was the only way they could go forward. What are your kind of reflections on how that's played out?
Well, I think it went as well as anyone could have really hoped for. There was a big debate, and it happened here as well in the Premier League that, how safe is this? You have people in close contact, they're grappling with each other, they come up each other very, very closely. And how safe is it to play that kind of game in this crisis? And luckily, the answer is that it's been actually very safe. The combination of regular testing and the measures that they've taken off the pitch resulted in almost no infections. I don't think they've found anyone so far who's actually infected during a game or by his teammates, at least as far as we know. And the absolute numbers are very, very small. So it's been very successful in that respect. But of course, it is a diminished product, if you will. It is very much a diminished experience. You can't nearly enjoy it as much. Obviously, not being in the stadium is not great, and even watching at home, it is okay, but it's nowhere near the thing that you really love and enjoy. So, the earlier it comes back, the better. But I think most people, apart from sort of let's say sort of football fundamentalists or romanticists, understood that the ghost games were a way to just tide us over until football can come back in a more regularly enjoyable sense. And there was just no alternative. The clubs had to do it because otherwise the financial hit would have just been catastrophic. So as much, I think, as we would have liked to all take a sort of principled view and says, football without fans is nothing, let's just call the whole thing off, it was just never an option, unfortunately.
And it's been interesting watching, particularly I think the Bundesliga, the home advantage has just been massively eroded. And we've seen lots of results there's certain exceptions, but lots of results where the sort of traditional logic of you ought to be in a stronger position playing from home has been completely destroyed. It's been fascinating to watch.
Yeah, I think home advantage has held up a little bit better in the Premier League for whatever reason. But in the Bundesliga, the numbers collapsed. They weren't that high to begin with. Home advantage is diminishing as travel becomes easier, as the pitches are better and more uniform, etc. But we have seen the numbers go down quite dramatically. I think they went from 43 to 33%, which is almost like a home disadvantage now. And it just shows you, I think, that despite some people saying it's about the architecture and it's about the travel, that the biggest impact is psychological, because or maybe physiological if you consider the fact that maybe the noise actually affects people in a physical as well as a mental sense. But without that noise, you might just be playing in a park, and the better team tends to win and the worst team tends to lose. And if it's evenly matched, then it's anyone's game because it's neutral ground to all extent. So yeah, that has been a very insightful, I think, lesson of all of this.
What I find interesting as well is you look at the players. I mean, it's a very unusual set of circumstances for them, because not just are you playing in a kind of very silent arena where you can hear each other, but they've had to live very weird lives in terms of the sort of bubbles that they've had to exist in. Yeah,
I mean, I guess players exist in a bubble anyway to one degree or another. But of course, there was an extreme version of that because they went into team quarantine before the games restarted. Some teams kind of stayed in that quarantine almost. Others came in and out. They were allowed to be with their families during games. So there were various sort of rules for that. But of course, even those who did go home were told to avoid public places, to not go shopping, to not go to restaurants, all the things that by now at least are common again for anyone who's not playing football. But they are still isolated. And one of the funny things, if you will, from the dynamics in Germany was that when the concept was initially devised, it looked almost futuristic. Who can think about playing football in this coronavirus crisis? By the time the game started in mid-May, much of German public life had returned to some semblance of normalcy. So you had people sitting in restaurants, people going to bars, people sitting in the tube, but no one being in the grounds, and players not even shaking hands and making sure that even the subs are far removed from the rest of the team. So the protocol was almost too stringent in its sort of effort and need to show to the authorities that football is going to do whatever it takes to make this happen. By the time these games actually came along, much of society had moved on. I guess in England, it's slightly less of a schism because it started later, and the general opening up of the lockdown started later as well. But it's beginning, I think, to have the same kind of weird effect where you see most pubs being reopened, etc., but still stadiums being empty and people wearing masks, etc., in the ground.
Right. I mean, it did look, particularly the early Bundesliga, it looked like theatre. And you sort of had these, there was a sort of a slight inconsistency around who was wearing masks. Some interviewers were wearing masks, and then some managers would and wouldn't. And it was almost a sort of strange piece where there was a lot of effort on looking like they're complying with rules. So sort of, visual compliance as opposed to necessarily what was going on behind the scenes. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people sort of remarked and said, where's the logic in players being on the pitch, and then when they come off it, they put the mask on. Right. The Bundesliga, the logic was that you cannot avoid contact on the pitch, but as soon as you're off it, when you can, it's still worth pursuing as much distance as possible, because you could have a case where, let's say, a substitute tests positive. If you've kept that substitute away from everyone, you can then easily turn around to the authorities and say, look, yes, there's a positive case, but there's no point sending the whole team down to quarantine and for us now to miss the next 2 weeks. And the other teams, of course, then also missing the games because we can't play them. We can isolate the guy because he was separate. So by putting these additional barriers in, if you will, it was just a bit of a safety valve to show to the authorities that everything was being done to mitigate a possible infection. And I'm not sure they communicated that very well, but there was some kind of internal logic to it, even though it wasn't necessarily an obvious one.
And there were a couple of instances which sort of looked like they were letting the side down. So there was Solomon Kalou, who UK listeners will remember playing in the Premier League, now plays in Berlin. And he did a kind of, Instagram live stream behind the scenes at his club, which showed that people weren't, and he in particular wasn't necessarily respecting the rules, but that was a sort of quite an interesting moment, potentially could have done in terms of ruining this clean image. I mean, it seemed to go okay in the end, but that was a really interesting moment, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, it was hugely embarrassing because the games hadn't started yet. So the protocol was in place, but they were still waiting for the final green light from the authorities. And I think a couple of days or 3 or 4 days before the final green light was supposed to come, or maybe it was a week, Kalou kind of exposed, at least in Berlin, how lax the club was following the restrictions. There were handshakes in the dressing room. The coronavirus test itself seemed to be quite... carelessly done, shall we say. And it was hugely embarrassing to everyone. But fortunately for the league at that moment in time, I think the authorities had already, the local authorities, the powerful regional states had already kind of decided that they wanted football to come back. And they treated this case as maybe even a sort of a useful wake-up call for everyone to see, this is what can happen if you don't pay attention, and we won't allow it. So slap on the wrist, and you have to improve, but we actually want you to come back. So a lot of people thought that was going to be the end of German football this summer. But I guess there was enough political will and good lobbying behind the scenes on behalf of the clubs and the league to ultimately make this just an embarrassing incident, but one that had not nearly as much impact in a negative sense that people feared at the time.
Right, because I saw it and I just thought this is game over. I mean, it's just literally because it was. I have a newsletter and I featured it in there as an example of stuff. Here's how one employee just by doing something can screw you over potentially. And so I genuinely thought that was it. But he, I think he's still suspended from the club, but he sort of seems to, the consequences, neither for the club nor for the sport, seem to have been that great.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was easy to write off as a exception to the rule or a single case. It wasn't representative. It was not reflective of what was being done everywhere. And I think ultimately it came down to both politics and German football doing enough to kind of force the argument that this was just a hiccup rather than the total end of it. And I think what people learned along the way was that with football and the players being fairly low risk in terms of the demographics and the age, etc., that football was kind of trying to over-deliver almost. And this goes back to what you said earlier. I don't want to say put on a show, but at least to be seen to do everything by the book, whereas in reality, it probably wasn't quite necessary to be as stringent. But the idea, and it's clever thinking, was to basically over-deliver or overperform in order to get the okay from the authorities. So you had to sort of secure 100% within the acceptable risk of solutions or of addressing that risk, even though I think in reality everyone realized it wasn't probably going to be falling a little bit below those standards, but it was still seen as acceptable ultimately.
And then there was that other hilarious incident where a manager, Heike Herrlich, I think he was going to buy some toothpaste and breached the kind of sanitary cordon, which again I thought was just a really interesting example of such a silly little mistake that you would think had been compensated for. But again, that made big headlines, and I think partly because people were looking for a story. But again, that they dealt with that quite deftly, thereby recognizing, I guess, that probably it was inevitable someone somewhere was going to do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in his case, he was saved by the fact that he wasn't infected. And I think that was ultimately the difference maker. He was put into a quarantine, so he wasn't able to coach the team in his first game because he had been appointed during the coronavirus break. It was hugely embarrassing. The way he told the story was problematic because he didn't seem to realize at first what he had done. He was just relaying the story of him absentmindedly going into a supermarket without having the mask on. And then I think later everyone realized, not only did he do stuff he shouldn't have done, but also he broke the bubble and now needs to be put into a bubble by himself. So it's a very inauspicious start for his career. But again, I think what people realized again is that, 3 or 4 days later, you have 2 or 3 negative tests and it was fine. I mean, there was a risk, but he got lucky, if you will. Or the risk wasn't that big to begin with in a supermarket with a mask on, to not actually endanger anyone, even though, of course, it could have happened in theory. But I think we got lucky in a sense that we didn't hear from a case where someone's partner, is positive and then through them, without anyone's fault, infects the whole bubble. And then suddenly you have like 3 or 4 teams out, at least in quarantine. It could have happened, but it didn't. And that's why ultimately they were able to finish everything on time. And now it looks like a huge success in terms of the concept and the way it was utilized and the way they managed to get it over with.
I mean, there's a really interesting parallel as you talk around the mask wearing thing, right? Which is I can as my own club, I can do everything possible. But if someone else stuffs this up for us, the competition is over because we can't play each other, as you say. So it's a little bit like you need other people. So there's a clever sort of pro-social element that requires things you can't control to be working effectively together. And I think that was demonstrated to work pretty well, albeit that there's a massive financial imperative to get that right.
I mean, there were some people being very cynical and saying, you know what, if you are fighting against relegation, maybe it would be quite convenient if you have suddenly a few cases. But as much as it's sort of a juicy theory, I think it's still pretty hard to pull off to somehow arrange for your team to test positive, even if you wanted to. So we had, of course, the case with Dynamo Dresden, who were very heavily affected. They were the only team who collectively from the second Bundesliga were sent into quarantine. They missed a couple of games. They started much later. They weren't fully fit, and they lost most of the games and got relegated from Bundesliga 2. And they were the victims, if you will, of this whole thing. But the league, I think, was secretly, I don't say planning, but at least sort of evaluating the possibility that there might be one or two of these cases, and that the competition might have to be stretched out into July just to finish these games. But they managed to finish it because Dresden proved to be the only case.
The other bit that was quite astonishing was there was this clearly a serious risk of fans turning up, and with I think a couple of exceptions, Dresden being one, and in Bielefeld where there was a strange, and then the top of the second division where there was a strange issue where fans turned up at the ground and were then rewarded by seeing the trophy that the team had won, which didn't seem to me to be particularly sensible. But for the rest of it, the fans generally stayed away, which I thought was really interesting, given some of the scenes that we'd seen in, I think it was Paris beforehand, where prior to lockdown, there'd been games played behind closed doors and fans had still turned. Pretty amazing that actually the population and given the passion for the sport, that the fans managed to kind of control themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think by the time the games restarted, I think there was a lot more awareness of the dangers of congregating, and that it just wasn't in anyone's interest to do it. In Paris, what I think it tends to be forgotten is that it was a few hundred or maybe a couple of thousand, but that was actually allowed by the municipality. So they gathered there outside, and it was a demonstration, or however was declared politically, administratively, but it was actually within the rules at the time. An amount of people could still turn up and do something outside. What became quite clear was that the organized fan groups in Germany had been very responsible. Not only had a lot of them actually helped out with coronavirus, donating money, donating time, being very, very helpful and socially conscious of what was necessary, but also that they had absolutely no intention of somehow either celebrating the fact that football was back or protesting against it by turning up and kind of sabotaging the games. They were not interested in either of them. And a lot of the fears and the hand-wringing and so on just proved completely baseless at the end, because the clubs very quickly realized, in talking to their fans, that there was just very, very little danger. I mean, who knows? We simply don't know what would have happened if, let's say, Borussia Dortmund end up winning the championship for the first time in nearly 10 years, rather than Bayern, who are kind of used to it and a little blasé. Right. I think it might have been very difficult to keep crowds apart. But then again, by the end of June, early July, public life in Germany had moved on again. And I think people wouldn't have necessarily frowned at this development as much as it was seen as a huge risk and a huge problem in mid-May still.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the fans in Germany are not averse to getting stuck into politics. And there were various incidents when the season was sort of running properly, where they were railing against ownership. So there's Dietmar Hopp. So for listeners aren't aware, he's the founder of SAP. And he's funded this club and kind of pushed them up sort of several divisions. So there's this idea that he's kind of a little bit of an arriviste with his club, and they don't like the fact that there's someone. So they protested around that, and so they're not afraid of being very active when it comes to sort of issues that they feel strongly about. So in a way, it's even more testament to the fact that they didn't sort of get involved in this particular piece.
Yeah, I mean, there were protests, but they were kind of silent ones. So banners were hung up outside stadiums, inside stadiums as well. I mean, to the club's credit, they allowed that dissent, shall we say in German? No, what's the word for this? That criticism, that opposition, to be voiced and to be seen by TV viewers. Boycotting those games and alleging that the league were just putting them on because of greed and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, the protest was there, but it wasn't followed up or underlined by any attempts to kind of disrupt the games going on. Because I think even the most sort of fundamentally opposed fan realized that the clubs had to come back. Otherwise, there would have been serious financial implications and financial problems for these teams. So as much as they hate the idea of football being played without fans, I think deep down they understood why it was necessary, and therefore nothing was done, as far as I know, to somehow take that point further and somehow disrupt those games going on. Also, the league had threatened, even though we don't know how they would have done it in theory, but they had threatened that games would be called off if there were protests outside and people congregating, and would be and the points would be awarded to the opposition. Now, whether that would have been feasible, because I guess 200 people would have turned up in false shirts, under false,
right,
pretending to be Schalke fans when they're Dortmund ones. I don't know, but I guess it acted just as another deterrent for people to just don't even contemplate doing it.
People that haven't watched the Bundesliga might not be aware, but there's very strict rules around club ownership that doesn't apply in, say, the Premier League in England, where they have this 50+1 rule that stops takeovers to the akin to the things that you see with sort of Middle Eastern takeovers of certain England clubs. And that's a very kind of core component of the structure in Germany. So there's a lot of tradition there. And how do you see that impacting the game and what goes on and the sort of the psychology of fandom?
Yeah, so in Germany, there is, because of those structures, there is a greater degree of accountability between the people who run the club and the people who follow as members and as supporters. Because in theory, not always in practice, but in theory, if you're really unhappy with the way your club is run by the chairman, 2 years down the line, there's going to be an election and you can vote him out, because he doesn't own the club. He just runs it for you. So there is a much stronger need to listen to the fans, because as members, through the rights of voting, they can control ultimately people who control the club. Now, that's a theory, because in practice, there's not always a second candidate standing against.
It's a little bit North Korean sometimes.
Exactly. But, if there was a huge outcry against your leadership, if people were really genuinely unhappy, then they could field another candidate. And we have seen cases where there's been a fight and, people stood against each other and things changed. So because of that democratic setup, the relationship between clubs and fans is less of a consumer and a provider, if you will, and more one where they run the club on behalf of you and people feel it is still their club. And that's why we see a strong resistance against changes to the existing structure. What's always difficult, I think, for people in England to get their head around is that people in Germany, by and large, would rather not be incredibly successful and win lots of silverware if it came at the price of selling to some investor who might be Russian or American or from Abu Dhabi, because they would no longer feel that it's really their club. So because we've never had sort of the benefactor model, we've never had factory owners, bankrolling clubs, as has been the norm in England since the late 19th century. There's just a completely different attitude towards money, towards investment, towards of ownership. And while there are some exceptions in the league, which are problematic because they're exceptions and they kind of threaten the other more organic model, if you will, by and large, people still are happy with it, even if it means that they won't be competing for trophies anytime soon. So the dream, if you will, the classic football fan dream in Germany is not to be bought by Saudi Arabia tomorrow, but for their club, through working hard and being smart and innovative decisions, to slowly but organically rise up the ranks and one day to be the best club in Germany. It might take 50 or 60 years. It might never happen, but that is the German dream, rather than the Cinderella overnight kind of turning into a princess story.
Right, which is sort of quite astonishing, because if you were to look at North American sports, or you said the Premier League, this willing, I don't know whether people willingly accept it, but it's sort of the way things are done. It's kind of like someone comes along, a Roman Abramovich character comes along, pumps some money in, and we kind of solve the sporting performance issue by stumping a load of cash and buying a load of players and kind of buying our way into a position. And that just doesn't happen under that structure, which is fascinating to watch. But there's also some problems as a result of that in terms of competitiveness.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Bayern have been playing the game much better than anyone else. Being based in Munich, where you had the advantages of inheriting the Olympic Stadium, which was not funded by them. It was funded by the municipality. But suddenly, at a time when the gates are everything, you have the biggest stadium in Germany. And they became very rich on the back of that. They also managed to, bring in strategic investors, minority shareholders, Adidas, Allianz. There's a third one, Audi, I think. And they can attract so much more commercial income than everyone else. So by playing within the rules, largely, they put themselves in a position where they're kind of unassailable. Dortmund, their nearest rivals in terms of the quality of the team and also in recent trophies, they start every season with about 250 million euros less than Bayern. So Bayern turnover 18-19 was 750 million euros. Dortmund's was 490. And that reflects, of course, on the pitch. And the next one then, I think the third one is down another 100 million euros, near the 300 million euros mark. So you would need ideally more Bayern Munichs, or at least more Borussia Dortmunds, to become more competitive. And the question is, where's that money going to come from? It either comes from what Dortmund have done, which is to buy really smart, sell expensive, use that money to reinvest, be in the Champions League all the time, slowly build your commercial income and slowly grow. And over the last 10 years, they've done it really well. Or you're looking for a shortcut, which at the moment isn't really that easy under the existing structures. Now, Hertha Berlin, interesting case, they seem to be going via the shortcut within the existing rules just by basically having a subsidiary company. So Hertha BSC, the club, is not for sale, but Hertha BSC, the club, own Hertha BSC, the football team. And the football team sells shares and has sold the majority of shares to an investor called Lars Windhorst, who's pumped more than 300 million into the club already. And suddenly they've gone from being mid-table to being at least a candidate for Europa League football for the next few years to come, and maybe more. But that is still very much, again, the exception to the rule, and it's yet to be seen whether other clubs want to follow that same course.
I mean, it's interesting when you look at these things because, as you said, there's been lots of sort of bending of the rules around. I mean, there's some legacy clubs that are owned by kind of factories. So VW, for example, because that was the team from the factory. But you've got things like Leipzig, where Red Bull came in, but they've created this kind of investment. They found a way to invest in the club, so sort of cheating slightly. And that's created some interesting tensions from what I can see in terms of sort of traditionalists. They can't really do anything about it because it's within the rules, but it's not really playing fair.
Yeah, I think it violates the spirit of the rule because clubs weren't supposed to be set up by a corporation for marketing reasons. Even going as far as having the RB for Red Bull. You're not allowed to call yourself Red Bull because sponsor names are not allowed to be part of the club name. But of course, the RB is mostly associated with Red Bull, and that's what people think about immediately. So they've been, shall we say, the most strategic and the most blatant. But you have clubs like Hoffenheim, who have a billionaire backer who doesn't officially own the club, but is the de facto owner, simply by way of putting all this money in. And the Bundesliga have developed this mechanism to say, if you've been supporting a club for 20 years, then we will eventually allow you to take it over. And that's another loophole in the 50+1 rule. So there's still only about 4 or 5 clubs in the top 36 who do it. But of course, every club that does it increases the pressure on the other normal clubs, if you will, to follow suit. And that's where the opposition comes from. Because, again, clubs or fans of clubs don't think, if only we could do what Volkswagen do with Wolfsburg would be so great. They're more thinking of, we might be forced to sell ourselves to compete, and we don't want that. So rather than attacking the system as such, they're saying, well, for every Leipzig and Hoffenheim, we become under more pressure. That's why we don't want these guys.
Right.
Unfortunately, the league allows them, and that's why the traditional model will become under more and more pressure, especially if fans one day turn around and say, you know what, it's great to be in charge, but I'd rather that we win the odd trophy from time to time. It hasn't happened yet, but a new generation might feel differently, especially one that looks at the Premier League with sort of envious eyes and see that the investor model has brought a lot more competitiveness at the top and has brought also added effects from internationalization and TV revenue. And ultimately, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Bundesliga to keep its own unique and very traditional, very domestic setup, and to square that with the need to grow internationally. These things don't sit together very easily. There was quite a funny attempt by the league in the past to say, yeah, Premier League is entertaining and all of that, but we are the most economically sensibly run league in European football. Our clubs are profitable. We don't spend crazy money. We don't distort the market. We don't have crazy owners who just spaff money up the wall, and sometimes clubs go bust, doing the needs. We don't have all of that. But then they realized, I think after a while, that to most people outside Germany, that's not really a huge selling point. Teams are really frugally run and balance the books all the time. They want to see the stars. They want to see the drama. They want to see the glamour rather than a World Cup of accountants.
Right. And of course, I mean, the biggest reason you need cash, there's clearly infrastructure, but is to buy players. And I'm intrigued sort of your thoughts on, one, what's happening at the moment with kind of player fees, because sort of if you look from outside the industry, it looks outside the sport, it's obscene amounts of money being spent on individuals. And those numbers are just getting higher and higher and higher. And yet Corona has kind of put a dampener on that. So there's two sort of dynamics I'm fascinated in. One is the Bundesliga's ability to spend money given the structures you've outlined and the pressures that plays. But then secondly, the sort of Corona layer on top of that. Yeah.
Well, I think the mathematical impact of coronavirus is fairly easy to surmise. For some big clubs in Europe, the stadium is less important than to others. Chelsea would be a good example. The stadium is relatively small. Not many VIP tickets that they can monetize. So for them, it's less of an issue than to Arsenal, for example, for whom the Etihad is a real cash cow. And basically, in the last accounts, made up roughly a quarter of all income at around £100 million. So you take that away, or you take 3/4 of that away, and that money corresponds to a big transfer, to the 70 to £100 million transfer that you would have liked to make, or that you were able to make last year with Pepe coming to Arsenal. So clubs are hamstrung by that chunk of money just not being there next season, or if you count half of the season and half of the next season. And that has a huge knock-on effect. Now, that doesn't mean to say that in some individual cases where there is a market for one particular player and a buyer for one particular player, that we will not see big transfers. And we have seen already Timo Werner move, and we will probably see Kai Havertz move, and we might still see Jadon Sancho move. But of course, in a normal market, you would have had 2 or 3 clubs being interested in these players. At the moment, there seems to be only one club interested every time, which naturally depresses the value. The values have held up because clubs are not quite in a position where they have to sell. If you want to compare it to, let's say, normal people, they have a house that is worth a lot. They might have some financial difficulties, but they're not prepared to take a huge hit on the most valuable asset that they have, because they're hoping that, holding on to it for another 6 months or 12 months, the value will rebound. So we don't see distress selling as such in the market. But of course, we see much less activity, both in terms of individual, but also in terms of the number of deals that are being done. And that is definitely an effect from COVID-19. If you ask me about players in a more general sense, I think they're still being undervalued. It actually sounds weird and might, surprise or shock maybe some of your listeners. But if you consider the power of these players to gather eyeballs and get millions of people to tune in at a specific time and watch religiously every single game of this team, it doesn't really compare with anything in the entertainment industry. Netflix, yes, but people watch at different times. People might never watch. I mean, it doesn't compare with the game that has to be watched on Saturday, 3:00. And if you don't watch it, you feel that you miss out. And I think football's ability to deliver audiences so regularly, with so much passion, so much commitment, focus for 90 minutes, don't go anywhere between the game, pausing it to have a beer or something. No. It still makes it an undervalued proposition. And that's, in my view, the reason why we still see investment coming into the game. And that's why I think ultimately, even though maybe TV rights have reached a bit of a ceiling at the moment, the value will hold or increase, because it's one of the few things that works in an era of complete audience fragmentation.
That's fascinating. But I mean, as you talk, there's that, and then if you look at shirt sales as a sort of regular purchase release, every season there's a new design. In fact, there's several designs because you want an away shirt and a home shirt, and they change them slightly each year, and then you can have the play. And if you look at what those cost relative manufacturing, the margin on those is massive. So it's fascinating to watch. There's the game itself, but there's the periphery around it and the endorsements and the advertising and all those pieces that are driven by, that aren't necessarily around the game, but just separate to that. The sort of image rights piece is phenomenal as well.
Yeah, and clubs have really cottoned on to that. It's not just in terms of creating merchandising, but it's also utilizing the brand almost like a media brand would. So if you're Liverpool, your main selling point is the games, and you make your most money from selling the games through the rights of the leagues. But there's also money to be made by selling your stories, by having specials being produced on Liverpool FC TV, by having teams and your players endorse certain brands in a very authentic style. And increasingly, I think clubs, the ones at the very top who can afford it, because it's less of a proposition for Burnley and for FC Freiburg, of course. But those at the very top, the huge exponential growth no longer comes from the ordinary revenues of income streams, like merchandising, like TV rights, but actually the exponential one is the branding and the commercial sales that they can put on top of that. So Liverpool can sell almost anything connected with Liverpool. And if they don't do it, somebody else would, media or people sort of associating themselves without necessarily having the copyright. So they do it. And they try to do basically like a 360 service for people interested in Liverpool. They want the Liverpool bet sheet. They want the Liverpool shirt. They want the Liverpool games. They want the Liverpool media. They want the Liverpool video. They want the Liverpool DVD. And at that level, clubs can manufacture their own content now in a way that was unthinkable a few years ago.
Yeah, it was a story I saw in Japan. My favorite one I've seen so far was Barcelona had plasters, which just randomly in the chemist, there's some Barcelona plasters, and they clearly were selling, right? And I was just like, well, if you can take it to that, that's pretty impressive stuff.
I mean, that's just a licensing deal, right? So it could be anything. I mean, you only go through the list of Man United and their famous sort of or infamous noodle deals, where they actually endorse absolutely everything. But I mean, the cost to the club is zero. The income is potentially enormous because you can do 100 different noodle deals in 100 different territories, and that's increasingly the way things are going. Every big telecoms company wants to associate themselves with a football team because they understand that engagement, that passion is worth something. And if you can be, the team in Egypt, for example, that has Man United, it will create value and glamour, and people think, I can kind of come closer to be with my team if I get the specially branded Man United SIM card or phone case. And that's how it works.
Right. That's very, very interesting. Two more things I want to pick your brains on. The first is VAR, which for non-football listeners is the video assistant referee, which has caused a heck of a lot of storm. But I think sort of seems to have gone down differently in different jurisdictions. I wanted to get your thoughts on that and how you see that. Because on the one hand, it's a great invention that referees are fallible. So let's introduce some technology to make sure that for critical decisions, we can get a second pair of eyes on it. But it doesn't seem to be working out, particularly in the Premier League, in the way that people were expecting.
Yes, I think that's fair. I think now, without the fans, one of the biggest complaints, of course, is not that relevant. The fact that people in the stands don't know what's going on and have to wait around. There is no one there. And for television, I think it's far less of a problem because you can fairly quickly show viewers at home what it is that the referees are looking at. And you're basically looking at the pictures just like the referee is in real time. And you can kind of understand if they actually consult the monitor, which they should, and don't do often enough in my view, what the issue is. And then the referee can either say yes, okay, or no. The protocol, the way it's being implemented in the Premier League, I think has left a lot to be desired. Even in Germany, where it's, in my view, done more sensibly, there are people who, out of principle, reject VAR, who think it shouldn't be in the game for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are purely emotional. I tend to think that the anti-VAR sentiment is often slightly overcooked and a little bit pantomime. I mean, whenever people say sort of, it's killed the game, I'm not going to watch it ever again, I'm thinking, yeah, come on, next week again, because it's not the worst thing in the world if the referee makes a mistake and VAR either corrects him, which is good, or doesn't correct him, which just leaves us in the place we would have been without VAR. So I don't really logically get why people get so upset about it. I think if there'd been a bigger acceptance for referee mistakes to begin with, then the introduction of VAR would have been a lot less pressing. But because people don't tolerate mistakes, I think it's then difficult to turn around and say, well, we don't want VAR. It's much better when things just happen, because it wasn't really. I mean, referees would get slaughtered for weeks and days, for making mistakes. So I don't have a big issue with it. I think there seems to be a unique, slightly unique kind of English perspective, which is different to the German one on referees in general. I think in Germany, the assumption is that referees should be perfect. And if they're not, then having VAR to help them get better, it might sort of disrupt things, but ultimately it's probably not a bad idea. Logically, it's if you can sort of detach yourself from the emotions, then at least in a logical way, it helps them in a difficult job get better results. And people, I think, can understand the argument. The UK or the English perspective always seems to have been, as far as I'm concerned, is the referees are useless. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the game. They haven't played the game, so they can't really.
There's almost this implicit, I could have done a better job, right? Which clearly, when you look at the physical condition of many of the people making the comments, it's just not true.
Yeah, but I think that it's basically underpinned by the general sense that they don't quite understand what it is they're doing. And adding another layer of referees on top of that basically just makes it more stupid for a lot of people. They think, okay, referees were bad to begin with, or it's sometimes said, we had the worst referees in the world and stuff. All hyperbole in my opinion. And then you add another referee with a monitor, and the effect is doubly worse. That's the perception, but I don't think it's really the reality. But I think it's something that's very, very difficult to argue rationally, because the response seems to be so emotional and so swept up in this sense of, I have this break in the game and I can't celebrate because I have to wait for VR to decide. And it seems to really rub people the wrong way.
Right. Yeah. No, there's always an interesting comparator there. Sort of German efficiency says, let's get the best possible answer. And then there's the sort of emotional, this is unnecessary innovation and bureaucracy. it's ruining the tradition of the game.
I mean, I don't think that most fans in Germany see it that way, but I think there's a significant sort of undercurrent of understanding where it comes from and understanding sort of the basic idea and thinking, actually, it's not a bad idea to get better decisions. Whereas, as I said, in England, I think there's a sense of bad referees make bad decisions. Now bad referees have bad decisions being made worse by a secondary level of referees looking at VAR.
I love that analysis. And look, final thing before I ask you for your Champions League predictions is I'm fascinated by the impact managers have. And there's a particular example that comes to mind that I think beautifully illustrates it, but there are plenty others. You know, if you look at Bayern Munich past season, so they had a coach who was doing disastrously badly, Niko Kovac. They replace him, and magically with the same team, you've got fundamentally different results, and they go on and win the league and the cup. And I'm just intrigued to see your perspective. I mean, why is there such a big difference between manager performances with the same teams?
Well, disastrously bad is perhaps an overstatement, because Niko Kovac managed to win the double in his first year.
This is true.
But it was done maybe despite his work rather than because of his work. And it got to the point where the team got together without the coach and said, okay, we don't really get along with him on a professional level, not so much personal one, but a professional level. We don't really think he's up to much, but it's our responsibility as Bayern Munich players to just knock down tools and to just have to go for it. And as soon as they got knocked out in the Champions League by Liverpool, they said, okay, we just have to win a double now. It doesn't really matter what this guy says. We just have to do it. And they got together and they played a good second half of the season, and they won a double, which speaks a lot, I think, to the mentality of the Bayern players, but also, of course, to their relative quality combining with everybody else, that they can kind of go through a season half-hearted and then just get their thing together in the last quarter or so, and it's enough to win the league because Dortmund and everyone else falters. This year, I think they would have had it for a disastrous season by Bayern standard. I think they were 7th when Niko Kovac was fired. And the relationship had really completely soured between him and the team. And in Hansi Flick, they found someone who the players like, the players respect, and who gave the players a structure, a tactical framework that they're much happier with. So, of course, Bayern's qualities, they were there. They were just hidden or obscured by Niko Kovac's problems. All just came flooding back. And it completely swept away the rest of the competition, who themselves, again, had some issues. I think Dortmund could have done better, Leipzig could have done better, but that is Bayern's quality. I mean, if you consider the fact that they can probably win at 80%, 85%, because their relative strength is so much better than everyone else's, if you get closer to the 100%, then you get to a point where they just win every single game, and they're just on a completely different planet. And he has won every single game apart from one in 2020. That was a draw against Leipzig, which they could have easily won. So the effect, I think, is one of a coach helping a team that is already the best perform rather than being a hindrance.
There's plenty of other examples. If you look at sort of Jurgen Klinsmann coming in to Berlin, which was an unmitigated non-success, I'll avoid saying failure. The managers seem to make quite a big difference. And it's sort of, in a way, quite surprising. It sort of looks quite surprising to me that they can have that much of an impact.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of studies being done and people looking at correlations between, money and results. And that still remains the strongest factor. You know, the best team has the best money, and they will play at a certain level, almost regardless of who's in charge. But of course, then you have transformative managers who can take a club that by terms of the money should be here and raise them up to a much higher level because they're just a uniquely impactful coach, whether that's through tactics or whether that's through man management. Christian Streich at Freiburg would be a case in point. You know, Freiburg have one of the smaller budgets of the league, and they regularly perform better than some of the bigger clubs because they have a superb manager who just finds ways of squeezing out performances of these teams who you look player by player, you think, what business do they have being in the Europa League? but they're getting the results. And Klopp, I think with Liverpool is another good example. Taking over a club that was sort of the third or fourth or fifth best, both in terms of money and in terms of performances, and just taking them to being the best. And that's where, of course, the real sort of expertise is being done. I mean, you could easily, I think, go into a club, and as long as you don't lose the dressing room by being stupid and being completely sort of out of your depth, you could probably just get the results that are more or less in line with the team. So you would take over a mid-table team, and if you just kind of follow the script that somebody else gives you and you're nice to the players, chances are you will perform in line with your ability. But if you wanted to take the team higher, then you need somebody very special. And that's why the best managers, are now being paid more money than some of the footballers, because the impact is at that level. Sort of the leverage, if you will, or the X factor is really then huge. But there's not many of them, which explains why they're so very well paid.
Fascinating stuff. Final question then is Champions League predictions?
Well, this year is different because we have only straight knockout games, no two legs. So not only is there no home advantage, but also the better team is disadvantaged because they don't get the average, if you will, from two games. A good team plays a bad team 100 times, they will win 95 times. Right. But if you play once, it becomes more of a crap shot. Chances are they still win, but they might lose and they don't have the second leg then to make up for it. So it is a lot less predictable than it was before. And if you see how the draw works, which pits a lot of the good teams on one side and PSG and Atletico Madrid on the other side, it's very hard then to find an overall favorite. I don't know, because the teams I would have tipped were all in the same bracket, so only one of them will make the final.
Right.
I don't know. I think you have to fancy either PSG or Atletico at least making the final, which on paper would make them the best bet, because everyone else is kind of busy eliminating each other.
It's like Game of Thrones on one side.
Yeah, it is absolutely
fabulous. I wasn't expecting you to come to anything firm, because that would be unfair, but I thought I'd ask anyway. Listen, Rapha, thank you so much for the time. It's been fascinating. I will put links to your books, all of which I highly recommend, your podcast, which I also thoroughly recommend, which dives into some interesting psychology. And if ever there was a maestro of the introduction of podcasts, it's you. There's been some exceptional punnery and other things in recent ones that I've thoroughly enjoyed. So I'll put links to that as well. And above all, thank you for your passion, because, as I said to you before we started recording, it's great to have somebody that really gets it and is able to transmit fantastic insight in a way that enhances the viewing experience. So thank you for that.
Very kind. Thank you very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Rapha for appearing and to you for listening. If you enjoyed listening to Rapha, then I highly recommend his Stylecast podcast, which has not only enhanced my viewing of the Bundesliga, but in doing so has provided me with a wealth of psychological insight. As I mentioned, he writes for The Athletic. There's a link to that so you can try out their month's free trial. And he's also written several books, which I've included links to, including the one on Jurgen Klopp. All well worth your time. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find it wherever you get your quality audio content. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this podcast. But in the meantime, stay safe, enjoy your football, and I'll see you very soon.